It began on a night when the sky itself seemed to crack open. The air was heavy, the kind of heaviness that makes the hairs on your arms stand straight up, as if nature is holding its breath. Over St. Jude's Parish, a storm rolled in without warning, dark clouds swallowing the stars, thunder shaking the very ground, and flashes of lightning tearing across the heavens. People who lived near the chapel said they had never seen a storm like it. It wasn't just rain and thunder, it was something fierce, violent, and strangely focused. As though the storm had chosen one destination. At the highest point of the parish grounds stood the Virgin Mary statue. For decades, she had watched silently over the town, hands open, face lifted toward heaven, a reminder of protection and peace. That night, she became the target of the storm. Witnesses said the strike came with a sound like cannon fire, so loud it rattled windows and set off car alarms. A bolt of lightning, white-hot and merciless, shot down from the clouds and hit the statue directly. People gasped as light surged brighter than day, illuminating the entire chapel yard for a split second before plunging everything back into darkness. Neighbors rushed outside, expecting to see rubble. After all, lightning doesn't strike gently. A strike like that should have shattered stone, left nothing but fragments of what once stood there. But when the storm subsided and people gathered around, they found the statue still standing. Not cracked, not broken, not even leaning. What they saw instead left them speechless. Across the chest of the Virgin Mary statue, running from her shoulder to her waist, was a dark burn mark. But it wasn't random. It wasn't the jagged, senseless streak of damage that lightning usually leaves behind. It was something else, something unmistakable. The burn mark had formed into the shape of a cross, perfectly straight, perfectly centered. People fell silent, staring at it in disbelief. Some crossed themselves on instinct. Others whispered prayers under their breath. A few dropped to their knees right there in the wet grass. One woman later said she felt her heart seize in her chest, as though she had just witnessed a warning or a blessing, or perhaps both. The first thought among many was simple. This had to be a miracle. What else could explain it? Out of all the shapes lightning could have left, why a cross? Why on her chest, as if branded by heaven itself? It was too precise to be chance, too deliberate to ignore. And yet, not everyone was convinced. Some said it was nothing more than a coincidence that lightning burns in strange ways all the time. But even the skeptics admitted something was strange. The mark was too sharp, too defined, too perfect. As the crowd stood in stunned silence, someone whispered, "She was struck, but she still stands." Those words carried through the parish like wildfire, and by morning, the statue would no longer belong to just the small community of St. Jude's. It would belong to the world. When the storm finally broke and the skies cleared, the first one to truly see what had happened was not a crowd, not a camera crew, but a single man. His name was Daniel Ruiz, the parish caretaker. For years, Daniel had been the one who unlocked the chapel before dawn, swept its floors, tended the candles, and trimmed the roses at the base of the statue. He was a quiet man, the kind who spoke only when needed, but his loyalty to the parish was known by everyone. That night, when lightning struck, he was the one closest to the scene. Daniel had taken shelter in the rectory when the storm rolled in, but once the thunder quieted, he ventured out, lantern in hand. The ground was still slick with rain, the air still humming with the metallic aftertaste of electricity. He made his way toward the statue, expecting to find it shattered, maybe even toppled. His heart pounded as the lantern's light reached her face, and he froze. The Virgin still stood, her stone expression as calm as ever. But across her chest, the lantern revealed the unmistakable blackened imprint of a cross. Daniel's knees buckled, and he dropped the lantern into the wet grass. For a long moment, he just stared. He later confessed he wasn't sure whether to weep or run. His first instinct was, fear not the kind that makes you scream, but the kind that roots you in place, paralyzes you. It wasn't just what he saw, but the sense of presence that came with it, as if the statue had been marked by something greater than lightning. When he regained his strength, Daniel fell to his knees in the mud. He touched the base of the statue, whispering prayers under his breath. Ave Maria, Ave Maria. He said later that the air felt warmer near her, as though the mark itself carried a pulse, a lingering energy. Whether imagination or miracle, Daniel believed he was standing in the middle of something holy. By morning, Daniel had told Father Miguel, the parish priest, what he'd seen. Father Miguel, cautious but faithful, went to see it for himself. When he laid eyes on the cross-shaped burn, he knew immediately this was not something to keep quiet. News of miracles doesn't stay hidden, not in small towns where whispers travel faster than the wind. Within hours, parishioners began to gather. Daniel watched as mothers led their children to the statue, their hands trembling as they pointed to the mark. Old men leaned on canes, shaking their heads in awe. Some people cried openly, others stood in silent reverence, but everyone who saw it left changed. The caretaker who had first witnessed it now found himself surrounded by crowds, all demanding to know what he felt that night, what he saw in those first moments after the storm. Daniel never claimed more than what he witnessed: a lightning strike, a statue unbroken, and a cross etched perfectly on her chest. But as he told his story again and again, the power of the miracle seemed to grow. People weren't just listening, they were believing. And belief, once it takes root, spreads faster than fire. By the second day, the story had already slipped beyond Daniel and Father Miguel's careful watch. Word of mouth is powerful in small towns, and inside the parish, whispers carried further than the Sunday bells. People who hadn't set foot in the chapel for years began appearing again, curious, hesitant, some almost guilty for returning. They came quietly at first, standing at the back, straining for a glimpse of the statue through the crowd that now seemed permanently stationed around her. Whispers rose like incense. "It's real. It's a sign. She's warning us." Others said, "She's protecting us." No two stories matched, yet every voice carried conviction. Mothers clutched rosaries tighter, while teenagers, usually restless and distracted, sat still on the cold stone floor, staring at the cross-shaped burn with wide eyes. Something was happening, and even those who didn't understand it felt the weight of it pressing on their hearts. In the pews, debates simmered. Some swore it was a miracle, proof that heaven was watching, that faith still mattered in a world drowning in doubt. Others whispered darker theories that the cross was a warning, a judgment, that the town had been chosen for something it might not survive. And in every corner of the parish, the question repeated in hushed tones: why here? Why us? The statue itself seemed unchanged by the storm, still standing tall and serene as she had for decades. Yet to those who came, she looked different now, more alive, more present. A farmer swore her eyes glistened at dawn, as if wet with tears. A young girl claimed she saw light radiating faintly from the burn mark when she pressed her palms together in prayer. These accounts spread quickly, and soon people came not only to see, but to touch, to pray, to leave flowers at her feet. Father Miguel tried to maintain order, guiding the faithful with calm words, urging them to focus on prayer rather than spectacle. Yet even he couldn't ignore what was unfolding. In private, he admitted to close friends that the parish had never been so full, never so alive with devotion. People who once treated faith as a Sunday habit now knelt for hours, whispering desperate prayers, as though the statue's mark could carry their voices higher than heaven itself. Of course, not everyone welcomed this surge of belief. A small group of skeptics from town stood at the edge of the gathering, arms crossed, shaking their heads. They whispered too, but their words dripped with suspicion. "It's just lightning, a freak accident. They'll use this to make money." They didn't kneel, they didn't pray, but even they couldn't stay away. Something about the statue, about the cross burned into its chest, pulled everyone closer, whether they believed or not. And so, the parish became a place divided, half filled with trembling faith, half with quiet doubt. But one thing was certain: no one could ignore the statue now. The Virgin Mary had been struck, and yet she stood untouched, marked with a symbol that would not fade. And with each whisper that filled the parish walls, the story grew louder, preparing to spill beyond the town's borders. By the end of the week, the statue had become more than a local curiosity. It was now the center of a quiet storm of its own, one that didn't bring thunder or lightning, but arguments and division. What began as whispers in the pews soon grew into heated debates that spilled out into the parish courtyard, the grocery store, even the town diner where farmers and factory workers usually talked only of weather and wages. On one side stood the believers. To them, there was no room for doubt. Lightning had struck, and instead of destroying, it had marked the Virgin with a perfect cross. That could only mean something divine. They called it a miracle, plain and simple, and their faith swelled with every retelling. They brought their families, their neighbors, even strangers from out of town, convinced that to see the mark was to witness God's hand at work. On the other side were the skeptics. They didn't buy into miracles. Some had fallen away from faith years ago, burned by disappointment or convinced that science explained everything. They pointed out that lightning burns can take odd shapes, that stone blackens naturally under heat, that people desperate for meaning will see symbols in anything. To them, the cross was nothing more than coincidence. They rolled their eyes at talk of miracles, muttering that it was all superstition dressed in church clothes. The parish, once united in shared ritual and Sunday gatherings, now felt split down the middle. After Mass, heated conversations broke out in the aisles. "Can you not see it? Look with your own eyes." One woman would argue, pressing her rosary into a neighbor's hand. "It's just a scorch mark," another would counter, shaking his head with a weary sigh. Voices rose, fingers pointed, yet the statue itself remained silent, gazing heavenward as though untouched by human squabbles. Even families weren't spared. In households across town, dinner tables became battlegrounds. Children repeated what they heard in school, some saying the Virgin's cross was proof of God's love, others mocking it as nothing but burned stone. Parents tried to rein them in, but often fell into the same arguments themselves. Belief and doubt clashed under the same roofs, leaving tension that no prayer or reasoning seemed able to settle. Still, the crowds grew. Each day, more pilgrims arrived. Some knelt in reverence, others came with notebooks, cameras, and measuring tools, determined to analyze the burn mark for themselves. And as both sides pressed their cases, one truth became unavoidable. Whether miracle or accident, the statue had captured people's hearts and minds. No one could turn away. For Father Miguel, this divide weighed heavily. He had always believed that faith was meant to unite, to gather souls together in peace. But now, he watched as arguments threatened to tear the parish apart. Every sermon became a careful balancing act, every word measured, as he tried to guide his flock toward humility and prayer instead of anger and pride. Yet the longer the mark remained, the harder it became to quiet the storm. For while skeptics argued coincidence and believers proclaimed miracle, one question haunted them all. Why did the cross refuse to fade? The first assumption everyone made was that the mark wouldn't last. After all, lightning burns fade. Stone darkens, yes, but rain washes, sun bleaches, and time erases. Surely, they thought, the cross would soon soften into nothing more than a faint discoloration, a passing scar on weathered stone. But as the days turned into weeks, something became impossible to deny. The mark did not fade. In fact, it almost seemed sharper than before. Parishioners who visited daily swore the edges grew clearer, the shape more defined, as though the cross wasn't receding but deepening into the statue itself. Children who were too young to grasp the debates around them still pointed up at the Virgin's chest and said simply, "The cross is still there." It was undeniable. The burn had become part of her, inseparable from the stone. Out of concern for safety, the parish council called in a team of restorers. They arrived with brushes, solvents, and equipment meant for preserving old monuments. Father Miguel hesitated, but the pressure to act was too strong. What if the mark was weakening the structure? What if cracks spread unseen? Under careful eyes, the restorers set to work. But no matter what solution they used, no matter how hard they scrubbed or how gently they cleaned, the cross would not move. Chemicals that stripped away dirt left the mark untouched. Brushes that scoured the stone could not lighten it even slightly. The cross remained, dark and unyielding, as if it had been carved by a hand stronger than theirs. When the restorers finally admitted defeat, murmurs rippled through the crowd that had gathered to watch. Some gasped, others cried. Believers declared it proof the Virgin's mark was meant to stay. Skeptics, though quieter now, insisted there must be some natural explanation, though none dared offer one aloud. From then on, the statue was never alone. Day and night, someone was always near. Candles flickered constantly at her feet, wax dripping down like silent tears. Bouquets of roses piled so high that their fragrance filled the entire courtyard. Pilgrims touched the stone reverently, their hands tracing the cross, some leaving behind notes of prayer folded into the cracks at the base. The statue had become more than a monument, it had become a living altar, one that people believed had been branded by heaven itself. But the permanence of the mark stirred unease too. To some, the fact that it couldn't be erased meant it wasn't just a blessing but perhaps a warning, a reminder that heaven's signs are not always comfortable or gentle. A few whispered that the Virgin carried the cross now because the town had forgotten its own. Such hushed fears grew alongside faith, feeding both reverence and dread. Still, the cross remained. Through rain and wind, through blistering sun and chilly nights, it never dimmed, never cracked, never softened. The Virgin Mary statue stood, as she always had, serene, unbroken, but now she bore the cross across her chest, eternal, unchanging, impossible to deny. And it was this permanence that drew strangers from beyond the parish gates, turning whispers into invitations and curiosity into pilgrimage. The first out-of-towners arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. A family from the next county drove an hour just to kneel before the statue. Then came an elderly couple who had heard about it through their niece in another state. Within days, license plates from distant towns began appearing in the church parking lot, and by the end of the month, the parish courtyard was no longer just a gathering place for locals. It had become a destination. Pilgrims came with cameras hanging from their necks and rosaries wound tightly in their hands. Some walked with limps, leaning heavily on canes. Others carried children who were sick, whispering prayers into their tiny ears. A few came skeptically, urged on by family members, their expressions guarded, their arms folded, but even they couldn't leave without at least staring for a long moment at the cross etched into the Virgin's chest. The town, unprepared for this sudden flood, adapted quickly. The diner expanded its hours. The small motel that had struggled to fill rooms suddenly had waiting lists. Vendors appeared outside the chapel gates, selling candles, holy cards, even bottled water labeled, "From the parish well." Some parishioners frowned at the commercialization, but others saw it as inevitable. After all, when miracles draw crowds, crowds bring needs, and needs become business. But at the heart of it all, the statue remained unchanged. She did not bow to the noise or the commerce. Day after day, the Virgin stood in her silent dignity, her stone eyes lifted to heaven, the cross across her chest the only message she seemed to give. And yet, that silence spoke louder than any words. For many pilgrims, just being near her was enough. People knelt for hours, tears streaming down their cheeks, clutching rosaries until their fingers cramped. They left offerings, flowers, photographs of loved ones, handwritten letters tucked into the base of the statue. Some lit candles and refused to leave until the wax had burned completely down, as if their prayers needed to last until the very end. Stories began to spread, whispers of answered prayers, of burdens lifted after touching the stone. A mother claimed her son's fever broke within a day of visiting. A man testified that his despair lifted when he knelt at the statue's feet. Whether these were coincidence or miracle didn't matter to those who experienced them. To the faithful, the Virgin's cross was already working, already healing. Of course, the more pilgrims arrived, the more skeptics grew uneasy. They worried the town was losing itself in spectacle, that emotions were running unchecked, that people were mistaking hope for proof. Yet even they could not deny the undeniable. Every day, more cars rolled into town, more strangers filled the pews, and more eyes turned toward the statue with longing, with desperation, with faith. What had begun as a lightning strike on a stormy night had now transformed into a movement. The Virgin Mary statue no longer belonged only to St. Jude's parish. She belonged to everyone who came seeking, hoping, believing. And as the pilgrims gathered in greater numbers, so too did the stories of the extraordinary stories that would soon grow impossible to dismiss. It began with whispers, just as everything else had. A woman from the next town claimed that her arthritic hands, stiff for years, loosened after she touched the statue's base. A young father swore his daughter's chronic cough vanished the night they prayed together beneath the Virgin's gaze. These accounts circulated quietly at first, passed along in conversations over coffee, or whispered in the pews after Mass. But like sparks in dry grass, the stories spread fast, igniting hope in hearts that had grown weary. Soon, more testimonies followed. A boy who had limped since birth was seen running across the parish yard after kneeling at the statue. A woman undergoing chemotherapy said her strength returned the day she laid a single rose at Mary's feet. None of these claims came with medical proof, yet the sincerity in their voices was undeniable. Pilgrims arrived not just curious anymore, but desperate. They came with wheelchairs, crutches, bottles of medicine, and photographs of loved ones. They came seeking not just to witness, but to be changed. Every evening, the courtyard transformed into a living shrine. Dozens knelt before the statue, candles flickering in their hands, tears wetting the earth below. Some prayed silently, lips moving without sound, while others cried out aloud, begging the Virgin to intercede. And though not every prayer ended in healing, enough did or seemed to that faith swelled like a tide, impossible to resist. Father Miguel tried to tread carefully. As a man of faith, he knew the church required discernment when it came to miracles. Yet as a pastor, he could not deny what he saw with his own eyes. People rising lighter, freer, claiming burdens had lifted. He found himself torn between caution and awe, struggling to shepherd a flock that was suddenly surging in number and fervor. The healings became part of the statue's story. Journalists arrived to interview those who claimed to be cured, their cameras capturing trembling hands, holding up discarded braces and unused inhalers. Doctors from nearby hospitals expressed skepticism, attributing improvements to psychology, coincidence, or remission. Yet the faithful were unmoved. To them, the proof was not in charts or data, but in tears of joy and the peace radiating from those who had once lived in pain. For every skeptic's explanation, a believer countered with conviction, "Go stand before her yourself. See what you feel." And many who scoffed at first found themselves drawn into the quiet power of the courtyard, kneeling despite themselves, whispering prayers they hadn't spoken in years. Whether one called them healings, coincidences, or simply hope made flesh, the effect was the same. The statue had become more than stone. She had become a vessel of expectation, a place where people's deepest wounds were laid bare, and where, for some, those wounds were met with something unexplainable. And as the number of stories grew, so did the attention. No longer was this only the talk of towns and parishes. The eyes of the media and the wider world were beginning to turn, eager to witness what was unfolding at St. Jude's. It was only a matter of time before the cameras arrived. At first, they came from local stations, one van with a satellite dish parked outside the chapel gates, a reporter holding an umbrella against the drizzle as she spoke into her microphone. But within days, the parish grounds were crowded with media crews from across the state, and soon after, from across the nation. St. Jude's, once a quiet parish known only to its small community, had become the epicenter of a story too sensational to ignore. Lightning striking a Virgin Mary statue and leaving behind a perfect cross. Journalists swarmed the courtyard, shoving microphones at pilgrims and snapping photos of the statue from every angle. Headlines splashed across newspapers. Miracle in stone? Virgin Mary statue struck by lightning cross appears. National talk shows debated it, skeptics and believers clashing live on air, while social media lit up with viral clips of weeping pilgrims and candlelit vigils. Everyone, it seemed, had an opinion. For the townspeople, the sudden spotlight was overwhelming. Streets once quiet enough to hear the birds at dawn were now clogged with vans, tripods, and tangled cords. The diner served more strangers than locals. The motel overflowed, forcing visitors to sleep in their cars. The once humble chapel now had more security than a concert venue, with volunteers forming makeshift lines to keep order around the statue. Some parishioners welcomed the attention. They saw it as a chance to share their faith with the world, proof that miracles still happen in an age that doubted everything. Others frowned at the intrusion, uneasy with cameras flashing during Mass and reporters interrupting moments of prayer. For them, the sacred had become spectacle, and they worried the noise of the world would drown out the voice of God. Father Miguel found himself caught in the middle. Reporters begged him for interviews, asking whether he believed it was a miracle, whether the Vatican had been informed, whether healings were being documented. He answered carefully, speaking of faith, of the importance of prayer, but never declaring outright what the church had not yet confirmed. Still, his calm words, broadcast across television screens, carried weight, and people flocked even more. The statue itself remained untouched by all this frenzy. The burn mark stayed, unwavering, defying both weather and science. The Virgin's face, serene and unbothered, seemed almost to mock the chaos around her. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted, skeptics argued with believers on the steps of the chapel, but the statue gave no answer, only silence. Yet in that silence, thousands claimed they heard something louder than words, a call to believe. And while the media came seeking a story, what they left with was something harder to contain. For the more attention the statue received, the more people felt compelled to come not to watch, but to touch, to kneel, to see for themselves what the world could not stop talking about. The story had escaped the borders of the town. Now, it belonged to the world. With the media frenzy came another wave of attention, this time from scientists, professors, and specialists who insisted that what people were calling a miracle could, and must, have a natural explanation. They arrived not with rosaries or candles, but with clipboards, cameras, and equipment. Some came out of genuine curiosity, others with the unshakable determination to prove that faith had nothing to do with it. The first team to examine the statue was composed of geologists from the State University. They studied the stone's composition, its reaction to lightning, and the way heat travels through mineral veins. Their conclusion? Lightning strikes can leave carbon burns, sometimes even in shapes that resemble familiar symbols. It's called pareidolia. One of them explained on camera the human tendency to see patterns, like faces in clouds or animals in constellations. To them, the cross was nothing more than an accident of chance, amplified by imagination. But when pressed by reporters, even the geologists admitted something peculiar. The mark's edges were too clean, too symmetrical, unlike any lightning burn they had studied before. One quietly confessed that while science could explain the burn, it struggled to explain its precision. Soon after, physicists joined the conversation, debating whether the lightning's voltage, combined with rainwater on the statue's surface, might have etched the cross in a way not yet fully understood. They published articles, gave interviews, and filled academic journals with speculation. Skeptics waved these explanations triumphantly, declaring that the so-called miracle had been demystified. Yet for every expert who tried to rationalize the phenomenon, there were others who stood baffled. A structural engineer declared the statue should have cracked under the sheer force of the strike, yet not a single fracture could be found. A chemist noted that the mark resisted all solvents, suggesting the discoloration had bonded with the stone in a way she couldn't replicate. And when doctors came to investigate the claims of healings, they found themselves with no clear answers either. Medical charts didn't align with testimonies. Patients improved in ways that couldn't be measured by standard tests. The tension between science and faith only fueled the fire. Believers said the experts' inability to fully explain the mark was proof that it was divine. Skeptics insisted that not having an answer yet didn't mean one didn't exist. Heated debates filled television screens, online forums, and even dinner tables across the country. Was it a miracle, or was it simply science waiting for better tools? Meanwhile, the statue remained unmoved by either side's arguments. She stood silently in the courtyard, rain sliding down her stone face, the cross on her chest as clear as the day it appeared. To pilgrims, she needed no defense. To skeptics, she remained an unanswered riddle. And so, in a world desperate for proof, the Virgin Mary statue gave none, only a mystery that neither faith nor science could claim completely. As the weeks passed, the story of the lightning strike and the cross-shaped burn began to divide not only the parish but the wider world. Faithful pilgrims continued to flood the courtyard, kneeling before the Virgin and whispering prayers. But alongside them came a different kind of visitor: skeptics, activists, and conspiracy theorists determined to prove the whole thing was nothing more than a hoax. Some accused the parish of staging it. "They burned it themselves," a man shouted during a heated town hall meeting. "They want donations. That's all this is." Others insisted chemicals or torches had been used to carve the mark into the statue, designed to look like lightning's aftermath. A rumor even spread that the parish had hired artists behind closed doors, secretly crafting the cross and then unveiling it as a miracle to manipulate the faithful. Father Miguel stood at the center of it all, weary but resolute. He denied every accusation, reminding everyone that the statue belonged not to him, not to the parish, but to God. "We have nothing to gain," he said during a Sunday homily, "and everything to lose if this were a deception." His words calmed many, but not all. Suspicion lingered like smoke. The arrival of investigators only fueled the controversy. Independent skeptics set up cameras around the statue, scanning for trickery. Activists demanded transparency, accusing the church of orchestrating a grand illusion. One reporter even snuck into the rectory, searching for evidence of fraud, but found nothing except a stack of handwritten prayer requests left by desperate pilgrims. Despite all this noise, the faithful were unmoved. They argued that the very persistence of the cross, the way it refused to fade, the way no solvent or tool could erase, it was proof of authenticity. "If it were fake," one woman told the news, "it would have rubbed off by now. But it hasn't. It won't. Because it's real." Her trembling conviction was echoed by hundreds who had come, seen, and believed. The skeptics, however, grew louder. Online forums buzzed with accusations of mass hysteria. Documentaries questioned the parish's motives, pointing to the sudden economic boom in the town as evidence of corruption. Miracles make money, one commentator sneered, and money blinds people to truth. The parish, for its part, used most of its donations to expand seating, improve lighting, and provide water for the swelling crowds. Yet for critics, even that was suspect. The division deepened. To some, the Virgin's cross was a beacon of hope in a fractured world. To others, it was a clever ruse feeding on desperation. And yet, through all the debates, all the accusations, the statue itself remained unchanged, silent, unbothered, her stone face lifted toward heaven as if untouched by human doubt. In the end, one truth could not be denied. Whether miracle or hoax, the statue had seized the world's attention. And with that attention came something neither skeptics nor believers could control, an ever-growing hunger for more. If the debates and accusations stirred noise during the day, the nights at St. Jude's told a very different story. When the cameras packed up, when reporters left for their hotels and skeptics went home to argue online, the courtyard of the chapel filled with something far more powerful than words: silence. It started with a handful of parishioners who refused to leave after dark. They brought candles, kneeling in the cool night air, whispering rosaries under their breath. But soon, others joined them: families, strangers, travelers who had driven hours just to spend one night in the presence of the statue. The silence of those vigils grew deeper than any sermon, more convincing than any debate. By midnight, the courtyard often glowed with hundreds of flames, each one a prayer rising upward, each one a flicker of belief refusing to be extinguished. Children slept, curled in their mothers' arms. Old men leaned on their canes with trembling knees. And young people, usually restless and distracted, sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the cross etched into the Virgin's chest. Some nights, the crowd was so large that people spread into the street, their candles lighting up the town like a river of fire. Even those who doubted the miracle found themselves drawn in, standing quietly among the faithful, unable to deny the atmosphere that clung to the place after dark. There were no chants, no shouting, no demands, just silence. And in that silence, many claimed to feel something stirring, a presence, a peace, a warmth that words could not capture. Pilgrims described the nights as different from the days. During daylight, the statue was a marvel, a spectacle, even a battleground for arguments. But at night, she became something else. A mother watching over her children, a beacon against the dark, a reminder that faith often speaks most loudly in whispers. Father Miguel often walked among the vigil keepers, his own candle glowing faintly in the shadows. He spoke little, offering only soft blessings, a hand on a shoulder, a word of encouragement. He confessed later that he had never seen faith so alive, never seen people so united, not by noise, but by silence. To him, it was as if the Virgin herself had orchestrated these gatherings, calling her children not to argue but to kneel. Of course, skeptics mocked the vigils as theater, dismissing them as nothing more than tired people staring at stone. Yet even some of them, caught in the stillness of the night, admitted privately that there was something unexplainable about the peace that lingered there. And so the vigils continued, night after night, flames flickering in the dark, prayers rising with the smoke. The parish that had once been just another quiet church now lived around the clock, a heartbeat of devotion pulsing day and night. But not everyone came to kneel. Some arrived with questions, doubts, even mockery. And one man, in particular, came determined not to pray but to challenge. Every miracle has its challenger. For St. Jude's, he arrived one evening just as the vigil candles were being lit. His name was Professor Harold Klein, a retired philosophy lecturer from the nearby university. Known for his sharp wit and his sharper tongue, Klein had built a reputation on dismantling religious claims in his lectures, mocking miracles as fairy tales for the desperate. When word of the Virgin Mary statue reached him, he scoffed, declaring it nothing more than a scorch mark dressed up as divine intervention. And unlike most skeptics, he decided to confront it face to face. Klein came armed, not with candles or prayers, but with words. He strode into the courtyard, his voice cutting through the silence. Superstition, he called it. A town drunk on fantasy. Pilgrims tried to ignore him, but his booming tone was impossible to dismiss. He mocked those kneeling in prayer, sneering at the cross-shaped mark. "You're seeing what you want to see," he shouted. "A stain in stone, nothing more." Father Miguel approached, trying to calm the tension. He asked Klein to respect the faithful, to allow silence for those who had come to pray. But Klein only grew louder, declaring the vigil a circus, the statue a fraud. His words stung, and some pilgrims wept, but most continued praying, their voices rising softly in defiance of his ridicule. That night, Klein left satisfied, certain he had made his point. But when he returned to teach his weekly seminar at the university, something strange happened. Not a single student showed up. His classroom, normally filled with eager faces, was empty. The next week, the same thing. His reputation for cleverness, for confidence, for tearing down faith with intellectual precision, seemed suddenly powerless. Students avoided him, colleagues whispered, and invitations to speak dried up. It was as though a curtain had fallen over his influence. Klein tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but the emptiness of those lecture halls gnawed at him. He returned to the statue, this time quieter, standing at the back of the vigil crowd. No one mocked him, no one jeered, they simply prayed. And for the first time, the professor who had built a life on tearing down belief felt small in the presence of silence. Later, he confessed privately that something in him shifted that night. He couldn't explain it, couldn't prove it, but the stubborn cross burned into stone no longer seemed laughable. It seemed immovable, just as immovable as the hundreds of souls kneeling in the dark, whispering prayers that no argument could silence. For some, faith begins with thunder and lightning. For others, it begins with emptiness. And for Professor Klein, the miracle was not the cross itself, but the way an entire town's belief stood unshaken against his ridicule. And while he wrestled with that truth, Father Miguel faced a different burden, shepherding a flock that was growing beyond anything he had ever imagined. For Father Miguel, the days following the lightning strike blurred into one long, unbroken vigil. From dawn until well past midnight, he found himself surrounded by pilgrims, reporters, skeptics, and parishioners, each demanding something different from him. Some wanted blessings. Others wanted answers. Many wanted certainty, a confirmation that what they were witnessing was indeed a miracle. But Father Miguel carried the weight of caution. He knew the church did not rush to declare miracles. Investigations could take years, sometimes decades, requiring evidence, documentation, and testimony. The Vatican, he reminded the faithful, would not be swayed by emotion or headlines. Yet every time he said those words, he saw disappointment flicker in their eyes, as if faith itself needed an official stamp to survive. The truth was, Miguel himself wrestled with doubt. Late at night, when the courtyard emptied and the candles burned low, he would stand before the statue alone, staring at the cross etched across her chest. Was this truly a sign from heaven, or was it, as the skeptics claimed, an accident dressed in holiness? He prayed for clarity, but heaven remained silent, leaving him to shepherd his flock with a mixture of faith and uncertainty. The burden grew heavier as the crowd swelled. Pilgrims begged for healing, pressing sick children into his arms, pleading with him to intercede. Mothers whispered desperate confessions, men wept openly at the altar, and elderly voices cracked as they asked if this was the sign they had prayed for all their lives. Father Miguel listened to them all, offering comfort where he could, but inside he feared failing them. What if he guided them toward false hope? What if the cross was nothing more than chance, and all this devotion was being poured into stone rather than heaven? Meanwhile, pressure came from outside the parish. Church officials began requesting reports. Journalists demanded statements. Skeptics wrote articles accusing him of fueling hysteria. Some nights he lay awake, wondering if he had allowed the situation to spiral beyond his control. He had asked for a humble parish life, but what he received was a storm of faith and controversy with no end in sight. And yet, amid the exhaustion, something else stirred. Father Miguel saw people who hadn't entered a church in decades fall to their knees in prayer. He saw hardened skeptics soften in the glow of candlelight. He saw neighbors once divided by grudges embrace as they prayed side by side. Whatever the origin of the cross, it was changing lives. It was awakening faith. It was healing hearts. Perhaps, Miguel thought, that was the miracle, not the mark itself, but the way it drew people back to God. And in that thought, he found the strength to continue, to bear the burden not as a weight, but as a calling. But the statue's story was not finished. For as powerful as the cross was, it soon became clear that this was only the beginning. Other signs, strange, unexplainable, undeniable, were waiting to unfold. The cross burned into the Virgin's chest was the first sign, but it was not the last. As weeks turned into months, stories began to spread of other phenomena, small at first, easily dismissed, but growing steadily harder to ignore. Pilgrims spoke of lights flickering in the chapel even when no candles were lit, of the faint sound of hymns echoing in the air, though no choir sang. Some swore the fragrance of roses drifted through the courtyard on nights when no flowers had been placed at the statue's feet. At first, Father Miguel dismissed these accounts as imagination born of fervent faith. But then came the night when dozens of witnesses claimed to see the same thing, a gentle glow emanating from the cross itself. It wasn't fire, it wasn't lightning, but a soft radiance, as if the mark was lit from within. People gasped, some falling to their knees immediately. Others raised their phones to capture it, but strangely, most cameras showed nothing unusual. To those who saw it with their own eyes, however, the experience was undeniable. It was like the stone-breathed light, one woman whispered tearfully. Soon after, reports of healings multiplied. Not just fleeting relief, but life-changing transformations. A man who had been blind in one eye claimed to regain sight after a night-long vigil. A child with a chronic heart condition left the hospital days after touching the statue's base, his doctors baffled. Families arrived with stacks of medical records, eager to testify that what medicine couldn't fix, prayer at the statue had somehow changed. Skeptics scoffed, of course, accusing the faithful of exaggeration or self-deception. They argued that desperate people will believe anything, that stories grow in the telling. But even among skeptics, doubts began to crack. Too many reports, too many testimonies, too many lives changed to dismiss entirely. The courtyard was no longer just a place of prayer, it had become a place of transformation. And then there were the visions. Pilgrims began reporting dreams and encounters, claiming that the Virgin appeared to them in the night, offering comfort, warnings, or calls to deeper faith. One young girl described seeing the Virgin weeping, her tears falling onto the cross across her chest. An elderly man insisted he was told in a dream to reconcile with his estranged brother, and when he obeyed, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Father Miguel struggled to contain the flood of stories. The parish office overflowed with written testimonies, letters, photographs, and recordings. The sheer volume made it impossible to ignore. And though he worried about false claims or exaggeration, he could not deny that something extraordinary was happening. The statue, once silent and still, had become a vessel for signs that reached far beyond stone. What had begun as one miraculous mark was now unfolding into a series of wonders that no scientist, no skeptic, and no believer could fully grasp. And it was only a matter of time before word of these events reached the highest levels of the Church itself. The Vatican does not rush when it comes to miracles. For centuries, the Church has been cautious, sometimes taking decades before declaring an event supernatural. Yet what was happening at St. Jude's Parish grew too large, too loud, too persistent to ignore. The lightning strike, the unyielding cross, the healings, the vigils, news of it all had reached Rome, and Rome was watching. One morning, Father Miguel received a letter sealed with the insignia of the diocese. It informed him that Vatican representatives would be dispatched to investigate the events surrounding the statue. The words were formal, careful, almost cold, but Miguel knew what they meant. The highest authority in the Church was preparing to weigh the matter. For him, the weight of responsibility suddenly grew heavier. What had begun as a small-town storm was now a matter of global faith. When the investigators arrived, they did not come with fanfare. There were no processions, no grand introductions, only two priests in black cassocks and a lay historian, accompanied by a medical doctor. Their role was simple: observe, record, and discern. But their presence sent ripples through the parish. For some, it was validation proof that the Church was taking the miracle seriously. For others, it stirred fear. What if Rome dismissed it as hysteria? What if the statue's story was declared a fraud? The investigators wasted no time. They examined the statue in detail, studying the burn mark under magnification, documenting its dimensions with meticulous precision. They observed the vigils, interviewing pilgrims who claimed to have been healed, cross-checking their testimonies with medical records. They questioned Father Miguel at length, pressing him on his own beliefs, his doubts, his responsibilities. Through it all, Miguel remained humble. He did not demand that the Church call it a miracle. Instead, he urged the investigators to listen to the people. Whether you prove or disprove the mark, he told them, you cannot deny the lives that have been changed here. For weeks, the Vatican team stayed, watching, listening, recording, and in their presence, more signs unfolded. A young boy rose from his wheelchair during their visit, walking unsteadily toward the statue as his mother sobbed. A man with a reputation for atheism was seen kneeling in prayer, tears streaming down his face. These moments could not be ignored, even by those trained to doubt. Still, the investigators remained cautious. At every press inquiry, they offered the same careful response. The Church does not rush. We are gathering information. Yet their very silence only fueled the fervor of the faithful. To them, the Vatican's presence was proof enough that something extraordinary was happening at St. Jude's. And while Rome took its time to deliberate, the statue gave no pause, no explanation. The Virgin stood as she always had, serene and immovable, the cross across her chest as sharp as ever. But the final tests were yet to come, tests that would leave even the most disciplined investigators with more questions than answers. The Vatican investigators had gathered testimonies, studied medical records, and examined the statue with the finest tools they carried. Yet one question lingered above all others. What exactly was the cross? Was it truly a burn? Was it pigment, soot, or some trick of stone? To answer this, they requested a series of scientific tests meant to remove all doubt. Samples were carefully taken from the statue under strict supervision. Tiny fragments of stone near the mark were removed with precision, wrapped, and sent to independent laboratories. Experts tested for carbon residue, for heat fractures, for artificial substances that might suggest tampering. The expectation among skeptics was simple. The cross would be proven natural, the result of lightning and nothing more. But the results only deepened the mystery. Laboratories confirmed that the statue had indeed been struck by lightning, no surprise there. The surrounding stone bore all the hallmarks of extreme heat exposure. And yet, the burn mark itself defied every expectation. It was not simply surface discoloration. The pigment had bonded with the stone in a way no chemical process could replicate. It wasn't just burned, it was fused, as if the cross had been branded into the statue at the moment of creation. Scientists admitted they had never seen anything like it. Even stranger, the mark showed no signs of weathering. Rain, wind, and sun should have worn it down, at least slightly, in the months since the strike. But it remained as dark, as defined, as the first day. Some argued this suggested human intervention, but further analysis ruled out paint, dye, or any artificial medium. It was, quite literally, unexplainable. The medical investigations proved no less puzzling. Of the dozens who claimed healing, several cases were reviewed in detail. One boy's spinal scans showed marked improvement that doctors could not account for. A woman's long-documented tumor appeared to have shrunk dramatically without treatment. In other cases, symptoms vanished, though no clinical proof could explain why. While skeptics pointed to placebo effects, even hardened doctors admitted they were baffled. We cannot verify a miracle, one physician said, but we also cannot deny something unusual has happened here. When these findings were presented to the Vatican team, their expressions remained composed, their responses careful. Yet behind their formality, there was unease. They had come expecting exaggeration, hysteria, perhaps even fraud. What they found instead was a riddle, a mark that resisted explanation, healings that defied reason, faith that burned brighter despite every attempt to cool it. Word of these inconclusive results leaked quickly. For believers, it was confirmation. Science had reached its limit, and what remained was divine. For skeptics, it was infuriating. The mystery had only grown larger, and in the middle of it all stood the statue, unchanged, unmoved. She gave no answers to scientists, no validation to skeptics, no declarations to the faithful. She stood in silence, bearing the cross as if carved by a hand no one could see. And as the investigations closed, what mattered most was not the reports filed in Rome, but the testimonies flooding in stories of lives touched, transformed, and renewed. While the Vatican weighed its reports and scientists debated their findings, something else was happening in the shadow of the statue, something no investigation could measure. Lives were being changed. Families torn apart by bitterness reconciled at the foot of the Virgin. Husbands and wives who hadn't spoken in months embraced in the glow of vigil candles. A teenager once addicted to substances testified before the parish that he had found the strength to walk away from his old life after praying before the statue. He held up his sobriety chip with trembling hands, tears streaming down his face as the crowd erupted into applause. Even skeptics found themselves caught off guard. One man admitted on camera that he had come only to mock, to prove his friends wrong. But after a single night in the courtyard, he said he couldn't explain what he felt, only that it was as if a weight he had carried for years had been lifted. "I didn't want to believe," he confessed. "But something here believes in me." The stories multiplied. A soldier struggling with nightmares found peace and sleep for the first time in years. A young woman contemplating ending her life claimed she felt an overwhelming warmth as she touched the statue's base, a presence that told her she was not forgotten. Parents of sick children clung to hope, some walking away with joy, others simply with the strength to endure, but all leaving with the sense that they had not prayed in vain. Father Miguel, weary but grateful, began collecting these testimonies in a journal. He didn't embellish, didn't dramatize, he simply recorded the raw words of those whose lives had intersected with the mystery of the cross. Page after page filled with handwriting from all walks of life: doctors, laborers, teachers, students. Each entry was a reminder that no matter what Rome decided, no matter what science concluded, something real was happening. Something that transformed despair into faith, bitterness into forgiveness, emptiness into hope. The ripple effect extended beyond the parish. Local crime rates dipped, a phenomenon police couldn't explain. Donations poured in not only for the church, but for shelters, schools, and hospitals in the area, as pilgrims insisted their blessings must be shared. A spirit of generosity swept through the town, neighbors helping neighbors in ways they hadn't for decades. For many, the miracle was not in the statue itself, but in what it awakened. The Virgin's cross had become a mirror, reflecting back to people the faith they thought they had lost. And in rediscovering it, they found themselves transformed. Even as arguments raged online, even as skeptics sneered and experts debated, those who had knelt before her carried something away that no one could take: a story, a peace, a faith restored. And as testimonies poured in from every direction, one truth became clear. This was no passing event. It was becoming a legacy. Years passed, and yet the mark remained. Rainstorms lashed against it, summer suns beat down upon it, winters froze it beneath sheets of ice, but the cross did not fade. It stood as sharp, as clear, as undeniable as the night it was first seared into the Virgin's chest. The town grew used to the presence of pilgrims, the flicker of candles that never seemed to go out, the steady hum of prayer rising from the chapel courtyard. What began as a lightning strike had become something permanent, something woven into the very fabric of the place. For the people of St. Jude's, life was no longer the same. The parish, once on the verge of dwindling, now overflowed with faithful. Not only on Sundays, but every day. Children grew up knowing the statue not as a simple monument, but as a symbol of resilience, of mystery, of hope. Families told and retold the story of that stormy night, passing it down like scripture. "She was struck," they whispered to wide-eyed grandchildren, "but she still stands." The Vatican never issued a formal declaration. Investigations continued, reports were filed, but Rome remained silent, as it often does with mysteries too great for quick answers. And perhaps that was fitting, for the miracle of St. Jude's was never about paperwork or proclamations. It was about the people who came, who knelt, who prayed, and who left changed. The silence of Rome only made the statue's voice louder, echoing not in words, but in lives transformed. Skeptics, of course, never disappeared. Some continued to argue that it was all coincidence, that the cross was nothing more than the randomness of nature mistaken for meaning. But even they could not erase what had taken root. The cross was there, the healings were there, the vigils were there, and faith, once reignited, is not so easily extinguished. Father Miguel, older now, would often sit quietly at the back of the courtyard, watching the candles flicker as the sun set behind the hills. He no longer wrestled with the same doubts that plagued him in the early days. For him, the answer was simple. Whether miracle or mystery, heaven or chance, the statue had brought people home to God. That, he believed, was the truest sign of all. And so the Virgin Mary statue of St. Jude's Parish remained not broken, not toppled, not erased, but standing tall with the cross etched forever across her chest. A cross born of fire, preserved by mystery and carried by faith. Generations from now, when the storm is long forgotten and the witness is gone, the statue will still stand. The cross will still shine dark against her pale stone. And people will still come, some to believe, some to question, all to see. For the world will always be drawn to what cannot be explained. And in that mystery, faith will always find a way to endure.